When Gwen and I lived in Lincoln, Morris Vinton was the pastor at the College View Church, so we had the privilege of actually hearing him give the sermon that I'm going to repeat of his today. It's entitled The Good News of the Judgment. I wonder how many boys and girls have ever been spanked. To spank or not to spank is a question that parents face. My father chose to spank. He was using something light one day after I had the spanking. I came into my mother with a smile on my face and said, "That didn't even hurt." And that was one of my biggest mistakes, because she told my father, and the next time it was the hose off of the tire pump. But the worst spanking I ever got was when my father didn't even touch me. We were at an island in the middle of Gull Lake in Michigan. My brother and I were at it again, fighting. That was our favorite pastime. We were spoiling the vacation for ourselves and our parents. My father tried everything he could to stop us. He tried isolating us in the cabin. He tried taking away our dessert, taking away our dinner. He even tried the hose off of the tire pump, but nothing worked. Until finally the moment came when they called us into them in the cabin. He had tried to find some other way to go, but he was obviously at the end of his ideas. Then I saw the tears begin to come, and tears on the face of my big, strong father was something new to me. And I realized that I had disappointed and brought heartache to one who loved me. I couldn't stand the tears. I could take the hose off of the tire pump, but I couldn't stand the tears, and I really wanted to change. That was the worst licking I ever got. Now it shows up in our study for today in Matthew, the 26th chapter, when we begin with verse 47. We are following Jesus in his last week, and the story continues in the Garden of Gethsemane. He was telling his disciples to go ahead and sleep now. And while he yet spake, lo, Judas, one of the 12, came, and with him a great multitude with swords and staves, the chief priests and elders of the people. In that same hour said Jesus to the multitudes, "Are you come out as against a thief with swords and staves for to take me? I sat daily with you, teaching in the temple, and you laid no hold on me. But all this was done that the scripture of the prophets might be fulfilled. Then all the disciples forsook him and fled." You recall that all this took place in the garden. You recall the kiss by Judas that was the sign that this was the one. You recall how Peter had taken up his sword and amputated the ear of the high priest's servant. And we notice how Jesus questioned the people as to why they came to him in this way. And then we notice that the disciples who had made vows that to never forsake Jesus, including Peter, who said he would be the last one. The others may leave, but I will not. All forsook him and fled. And then they took him to the palace of Caiaphas. There they tried to find false witnesses who would come up with the kind of charge that would make Jesus worthy of death. But the false witnesses conflicted, and their testimony did not agree. Jesus listened, we are told, patiently to all the conflicting testimonies. No word did he utter in self-defense. At last his accusers were entangled, confused, and maddened. The trial was making no headway. It seemed that their plottings were to fail. Caiaphas was desperate. One last resort remained. Christ must be forced to condemn himself. The high priest started from the judgment seat, his face contorted with passion, his voice and demeanor plainly indicating that were it in his power, he would strike down the prisoner before him. "Answerest thou nothing?" he exclaimed. "What is it which these witness against thee?" Jesus held his peace. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before his shearers is dumb. He opened not his mouth. At last Caiaphas, raising his right hand toward heaven, addressed Jesus in the form of a solemn oath. I adjure thee by the living God, that thou tell us whether thou be the Christ, the Son of God. And Jesus would not remain silent. He said, I am. As every ear listened to his admission under oath before the high priest, and every eye beheld, a heavenly light seemed to illuminate his pale countenance. And then Jesus said, Hereafter shall you see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. At this point in the council, Caiaphas shouted, Blasphemy! Blasphemy! And the rest of them took up the strain, and they began to push Jesus and shove him and buffet him around. It was awful that night in the judgment hall. They put an old rag over his head, and they struck him, and they said, If you're a prophet, why don't you tell us who hit you? They spit in his face. You know the story. You know the scene. The crown of thorns pressed on his forehead and all the rest of it. And it looks like Jesus is going through something like hardly any other man had gone through, even humanly speaking. Without the spiritual load on his shoulders, the anguish must have been terrible. But we are told that there was a deeper anguish that came to Jesus that night. And it's this deeper anguish that we need to consider for a moment, because it involved one of his closest followers. In the middle of all the pushing and shoving, something took place out by the fire. Peter was warming himself by the fire. His companion John had pressed through the crowd. Nothing could keep him away from the side of Jesus, but Peter had stayed further away. The story is so familiar, but sometimes we don't realize the steps that had taken place in the process. There are 6 or 7 steps that had taken place in Peter's denial of his Lord that night. In the first place, Peter had said, Though all are offended because of you, I will not be. This indicates self-sufficiency. He was sure of himself. He felt he was strong enough. He had enough willpower and backbone. He could make the right decision, and he was deceived into thinking he could follow through with it. He considered himself a self-disciplined man. Jesus could count on him. That's the first step that anybody takes toward denying his Lord. The second step he took was to succumb to the overwhelming feeling of wanting to sleep when he should have been praying. And that is always the step that follows when a person struggles with the problem of self-sufficiency. Who needs to pray when you can do it yourself? Who needs a higher power when you have plenty of power and strength yourself? I would like to propose to you that that is one of the main reasons why the majority of Christians do not spend enough time in prayer. They're doing all right, thank you. You can count on me, thank you. I am able, thank you. And so prayer is replaced by sleep in more than one way. The next step in the betrayal and denial of Jesus is a damaged spiritual judgment. You begin to do foolish things. Peter did something foolish. He thought he was big enough to take on the whole Sanhedrin, the mob, the thundering herd, with his sword, and all he got was one ear. It was rather stupid of him what he did there. As you recall, just analyze the whole scene. Jesus had warned him about that and had told him that he didn't need to do that sort of thing. He had tried to safeguard him from making foolish mistakes. Jesus gave him a gentle rebuke when he began swinging his sword. The next step is that he begins to follow Jesus from afar off. He keeps some distance between him and Jesus. He doesn't want to get too close like John did, afar off. And then the next step is that he begins to find his warmth and comfort where the world finds its warmth and comfort. John must have been cold that night too, but it made no difference. He was going to press close to Jesus' side. However, Peter, following from afar off, joined the rest of the world in warming himself by the fire. And there are more than one way to interpret that. The next step is, when he found himself under pressure, he denied that he even knew this man, Jesus. When a person is finding his warmth and his acceptance and his comfort in the world, and someone says, "Aren't you one of his?" "No, I'm not." That's the way it goes. The sidestepping, not letting it known, denying that we know him. And then when the heat comes on and the pressure is really great, and they point a finger at you, the final step in Peter's downfall, he began to curse and to swear and to deny with an oath that he ever knew Jesus. Well, right at that moment, I would like to have you in your imagination try to take in the scene as it's described in the classic On the Life of Christ, The Desire of Ages. It pictures Jesus turning right in the middle of Peter's oaths and swearing and looking at him. Jesus, from where he's being buffeted around and shoved and pushed and crowded, Jesus with the crown of thorns and the blood dripping down his face, he turns and he looks at Peter. There are different kinds of looks. Have you ever seen a situation when someone was angry and hurt and they have a look that indicates that? And have you ever seen a situation when a person is disappointed and sad and the look reveals that? There's quite a difference. When Jesus looked at Peter in the judgment hall, he didn't look at him with anger and self-centered hurt feelings. We are told that he looked at Peter with sadness, with disappointment, with pity for his poor disciple. Because when you really get down to it, Peter was not operating the way he was because he was a hypocrite. He meant everything he had said. When he said, "I will not deny you, you can count on me," he meant it. He wasn't being a hypocrite. Peter was operating that night from weakness. And all of Jesus' efforts to try and forewarn him had failed. So Jesus still had sorrow and pity for his poor disciple, and sadness and disappointment. Because if Jesus ever needed a friend, it was then. If he ever needed someone to give him a look of, "I'm still with you, I'm on your side," genuinely, it was then. So this is why some of the deepest anguish and disappointment came to Jesus that night. And as Peter's gaze met the gaze of Jesus, a flood of memories came back. He had flashbacks of scenes of life with the Master that he could never forget. He remembered the call by the sea when Jesus had said, "Follow me and I will make you fishers of men." He remembered the night on the lake when he had been presumptuous enough to think that he could join Jesus and walk on water, and how he had almost drowned, but Jesus had reached out his hand and saved him. He remembered how Jesus had come to his rescue in the temple over the hassle concerning the tax coin. He remembered how just a little while before Jesus had said to them as they were going toward the garden, "Peter, behold, Satan hath desired to have you that he might sift you as wheat, but I have prayed for you. I have prayed for you." And as all the times of Jesus and Peter's experiences came up before him, and as Peter looked at Jesus with the pale, suffering face and the quivering lips, as he looked on Jesus with the bloody sweat and his face convulsed with anguish, suddenly Peter broke from the scene. He turned and ran out of the courtyard and down the darkened streets of Jerusalem. He came to the Golden Gate and down the hill across the brook called Kedron to the Mount of Olives, and there he went into the garden and he groped around until he found the very spot where Jesus had prayed and sweat drops of blood, and Peter fell on his face on the ground and wished that he could die. It was the hardest licking Peter had ever gotten. Meanwhile, back in the court with Caiaphas, the shoving and the spitting and the shouting continued. The evening session adjourned, and they led Jesus across the court to a place called the guard room. In the guard room, he was not protected from the rabble and the rank and file. And through the hours until the morning session was to begin of this kangaroo court, Jesus received the most terrible and abusive treatment. Then, as the early hours of the new day came, they brought Jesus out again. And they took him before the court, and they continued to try and find an accusation that would accomplish his death. But they had no case.
The priests were pacing back and forth, tugging their beards and scratching their heads, trying to come up with something that would condemn him. They were fighting against time. They knew that if they didn't accomplish their purpose quickly, that the tide would turn against them, and the sympathizers of Jesus would come to the front, and they would operate on the basis of the thundering herd and the maddened throng. It was mob instinct at work, and they were trying to capitalize on that. But Jesus was as calm as could be. He knew that if he had chosen to, like Paul did later, he could have split them right down the middle. All he had to do was shout out the word resurrection, and the Pharisees and the Sadducees would be at each other's throats instantly. Now the problem with the Pharisees and the Sadducees was that they couldn't agree. And if they were to try to come up with some charges against Jesus, they would end up fighting with each other. Jesus had condemned their traditions, but they had contentions among themselves over traditions, so they couldn't condemn him on the basis of their traditions. They had accused Jesus of Sabbath breaking, but most of his Sabbath breaking had involved healing, and they didn't want to resurrect all of his healings in the minds of the people. But at best, it was a corrupt and rotten court. Jesus knew that his record would not stand in this court because Jesus' record was spotless, and this was a rotten court. He had no defender. Not even one voice was raised in his defense. I'd like to change the scene for a moment and remind you that according to Hebrews, Jesus was tempted like as we are in all things. Jesus knows what it's like to come up for judgment. Now, there are some today who are questioning the idea of judgment. The truth is there is nothing plainer in all the Bible than the teaching and the truth of the judgment. And it's very clear that there is a pre-Advent judgment, and we know when it began. And in this court, there's not a chance that our case will stand, because when you take the accumulation of us being born sinful by nature and what we've done with it in terms of our track record, we are hopeless in this court. This court is a good court, and our record will not stand up. We are all guilty, but I'd like to thank God that there is a defense, a defender who knows what it's like to stand in court without a defender. Isn't that good news? And he was in all things tempted, and his sympathies and his understandings are on our side. We have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ the righteous. To profess Jesus before this court or to deny him before this court can bring joy or bring anguish to the heart of Jesus. I'm going to finish with a parable. It says what I'd like to say concerning Jesus and the good news about the judgment. It goes like this. Tom was a criminal, a really bad one. He was not just your ordinary, everyday, small-town crook. He was big time. He was a cheat and a liar and a thief and a gambler. He was an adulterer and a murderer. He would sell his own mother if he thought it would get him what he wanted. He prided himself on having no scruples, but now he had been caught. Now he sat in prison trying to figure out what his next move would be. He thought desperately of escape, then of suicide, but neither were possible. He was too closely guarded. He practiced all sorts of speeches denying his illegal activities, but none of them seemed very convincing, even to him. He was in big trouble, and Tom knew it. The longer he sat there forced to think, the more despondent he became. His whole future looked black. Then one day, a prison official came to Tom's cell and said, "Tom, we have some good news and some bad news for you." Tom looked up sullenly, yet deep inside he felt eager for any change from sitting there miserably day after day. He braced himself for the worst. The good news is a lawyer has been assigned to your case, and he's the best lawyer in the whole world. Tom was silent. He knew there was a catch somewhere. Sure enough, the official continued. The bad news is that the prosecuting attorney has been assigned, and he's the best prosecutor in the world. Tom was silent. The prison official shook his head. That lawyer must be crazy to think of defending the likes of you. But anyway, he'll be in to see you tomorrow. And he turned and he walked away. The next day, a quiet sort of gentleman came to Tom's cell and knocked. Tom looked up startled, then laughed bitterly. You've got the key, man, so why knock? I only go where I'm invited, said the visitor. Well, come on in, said Tom. I'm not going anywhere. The visitor opened the door and sat down. So who are you anyway? Tom asked. I'm a lawyer, the man said. I understand that you are looking for a lawyer to take your case. Yes, said Tom. And it's about time they sent someone to me. But tell me about your qualifications. The man here said you are supposed to be good, but if you're too good, I may not be able to pay your price. Level with me so I can know what to expect. Well, said the lawyer, I have some good news and some bad news for you. The good news is that I've never lost a case. I can guarantee the outcome of the trial if you place yourself in my hands. And the bad news is the price, right? Said Tom. The lawyer nodded. Okay, lay it on me, said Tom. How much is it going to cost? It's free. I beg your pardon? It's free, the lawyer repeated. Hey, I'm not a rich man, said Tom, but I don't need your charity. If I can just get out of this dump, I can raise the money. The lawyer smiled kindly. No, if you want my help, you must accept it as a gift. You cannot pay me for any part of it. It is totally and completely free. It's one of the conditions of my taking your case. Tom was silent for a few minutes, and then he asked, Are there any other conditions for receiving your help? The lawyer nodded. I have some more good news and bad news for you. The good news is you simply have to ask me to take your case, and I'll take it immediately. But the bad news is that if I take your case, you have to plead guilty. Tom gasped. Aren't you guilty? Asked the lawyer. Well, yes, but if I plead guilty of all the charges against me, I won't have a ghost of a chance of going free. They'll throw the book at me. How could you possibly think you could help me if I plead guilty? I have some good news and bad news for you, said the lawyer. The bad news is, if you plead guilty, of course, you'll be convicted. And if you don't plead guilty, the prosecuting attorney has sufficient proof that you'll be convicted anyway. Either way, there's no doubt about it. You'll get the death sentence. Then why even have a trial? Said Tom. You've forgotten that I have some good news too, said the lawyer. I am willing to take your sentence and let you go free. No way, cried Tom. You aren't the one who's lived the rotten life. I'm the one. I've done nothing good. I don't deserve anything but death. Hanging is too good for me. I can't let you pay for my crimes. The lawyer replied gently, Tom, I already have paid. All that remains is for you to accept my substitution in your behalf. If you accept it, it's yours. After a long moment, Tom asked quietly, Is there anything else I should know before this trial? The lawyer nodded. Yes, I have some good news and some bad news. The good news is that you will be pardoned. There's no question about that. You will be able to stand before God and men as though you'd never sinned. But there may be some bad news for you. What's that? Asked Tom. Well, it's that you won't be a criminal anymore. Well, what do you mean? You'll be a new person. While you're waiting for your trial to take place, you won't continue to lie and cheat and steal and kill. You'll become pure and honest and trustworthy. We'll work closely together, you and I, and we'll become good friends. As we associate together day by day, you will learn to hate the things you once loved and love the things you once hated. You will become a new person altogether. I'm not so sure about that, said Tom. The prospect of pardon sounds good, but what if I go my own way? Can't we just arrange it so I can be excused from the penalty of my actions? Do I really have to stop being a crook? The pardon is only good for those who are willing to have a new life, said the lawyer. Tom stared at the floor of his cell while the lawyer waited patiently for his decision. At last, Tom raised his head. I would like to ask you to take my case. Tom and the lawyer shook hands and the contract was sealed. Is there anything else I should know before you go? Yes, there's one final thing, said the lawyer. I have one final bit of good news and bad news for you." Tom smiled. "Give me the bad news first and get it over with," said Tom, "although it doesn't seem like any of your bad news has been that bad." The lawyer smiled too. "All right, the bad news is that we have set the date for your trial." "Hey, that's not bad news at all," exclaimed Tom. "With a lawyer like you, do you think I want to stay in this dump forever and never even have my case go to court? The news of the coming judgment is terrific news, and your good news had better be pretty good to outshine that." The lawyer looked into Tom's eyes for a moment before he said gently, "The good news is this. When you come to trial, I will not only be your lawyer, I will be your judge as well."